Can you imagine what the world would look like without corporations? With the term corporate greed running rampant all over social media, I wanted to do a quick segment about the history of corporations, whether the term corporate greed is actually a real thing, and what might the world look like if there were no corporations. Well, hey there. My name is Kimberly Ferguson, and I'm the CEO and founder of Emerald Expectations Accounting. Welcome to the Emerald Corner, where owning a business means building a life you love, not sacrificing one. In today's episode, we are going to be talking all about corporations, but specifically, let's talk about the history of a corporation, the term corporate greed, where all that kind of stems from, and whether or not that exists in today's world. And how might the world be different if there were no corporations at all? So let's jump in. So, first of all, what exactly is a corporation? So, a corporation is a company or a group of people authorized to act as a single entity and recognized as such by the law. So, what people usually think of when they think of corporations is a C corporation. So, a C corporation is a type of corporation that allows you to have more than 100 shareholders. They can be any kind of entity that they want to. It's a completely separate structure from the owners of the company or the shareholders, and it's taxed at the entity level. And so there is no pass through to the owners unless dividends are paid out. The other thing is this type of company can go public, and so you can have shareholders on the stock market and all of that's fun stuff as well. The one thing that most people miss is that there's another kind of corporation, right? There is something that is called an S corporation. S corporations tend to be small businesses because they can only have fewer than 100 shareholders. They also can't have all these different entity types that own stock in the company. So, like a corporation can't own stock in an S corporation, and they're taxed at the individual level. So, any income or loss that comes from that corporation is passed down to the shareholders and taxed at the individual level. Okay, so when we're talking about corporations, most people either lump these two together or they completely throw out the S corporation and they completely ignore the fact that there are millions of small businesses that are C corporations as well. So let's keep all of this in mind as we go through this process. So the next thing that I want to talk about is the LLC. Okay. This is the most prominent business entity in the United States these days, right? However, the limited liability company, the LLC, did not come into existence until 1977. And 40 out of the 51 territories that are the United States did not accept the LLC as an entity until between 1992 and 1997. So, in all reality, LLCs basically have only existed for the last 30 years. So, what does that mean for corporations, right? That basically means that before 1992, every business was a corporation. So you had two options. You could be a sole proprietor yourself, or you could be a corporation. So if you wanted any type of legal protection, you had to be a corporation. So thinking about what the world would have looked like, or at least the United States would have looked like without these corporations, it's actually pretty glim. There's no businesses, right? So there's no products. Think about all the products that you love that were created before 1992. Everything pretty much. There's so many things that were created before 1992 that I don't even think you can really wrap your brain around it. And even more so, a lot of the things that were created after 1992 were inspired by or came off of things that were created before 1992. So basically our entire world in the United States as we know it would be completely different without those corporations that we so hate nowadays, right? So think about all the products, think about all the services too. Accounting firms, legal firms, engineering firms, construction companies, everything was a corporation before 1992 pretty much. And so none of that stuff would have really existed before then either. And where do all of our jobs come from in the United States? Before 1992, they were all from corporations, pretty much. Almost every person who was employed before 1992 worked for a corporation or the government, the federal government or the state government. But most people don't work for the government, right? Most people work for public, right? So, another piece of history from the corporation is that since 1995, according to the IRS, the S corporation has been the primary form of corporations. In fact, as of 2003, which was over 20 years ago, more than 60% of businesses that were corporations were S corporations. And as I said, those are not the public ones. Um, those are not the shares that can be purchased on the stock market. These are the small businesses, the fewer than 100 shareholders, the a lot of the time single member S corporations. So if more than 60% of corporations in 2003 were S corporations, you can only imagine what the number is now. We know it's like skyrocketed, right? So I wanted to share a few additional statistics with you that relate to corporations, okay? The first one is the number of employees in the United States. So this number comes from 2019 from the US Census Bureau. There were 6.1 million employer firms in the United States. So that means that they had employees, right? And of those, 32.6 million were corporations. So of these C corporations that had employees, 72.5% of employers had fewer than 10 employees. 84.7 had fewer than 20 employees. 96.2 had fewer than 100 employees. And 98.9% had fewer than 500 employees. So when we're picturing these corporations, we're picturing big corporations, hundreds and hundreds of workers, all of these things, right? And we just learned that 98.9% of corporations have fewer than 500 employees. So, do we actually have an accurate picture of corporations in the United States? I wonder. Another statistic that really got my attention was the fact that most people think that these owners of these companies are male, right? We think that they're men. However, according to 2020 from a National Women's Business Council report, 42% of US businesses in 2020 were women owned. And that was 4 years ago. So we know, again, that that number is on the rise. So it's not necessarily men in business that are causing all the problems as well. 42% of companies as of 2020 were owned by women. So I get this feeling, I get this thought in my head that we possibly have a skewed image of what corporations are in the United States, right? First of all, we think they're these huge companies that are publicly owned and on the stock market, and we think they have more than 500 employees and they're all owned by men. However, according to the statistics, we are fewer than 500 employees. Most of them are S corporations, and that's small business, a lot of times single owner businesses, and a majority or almost a majority are owned by women. So I want you to think about the reality of the corporations and how that compares to your view of corporations before we move on to the corporate greed conversation. So I tried to figure out what exactly is the definition of corporate greed because based off of what I've heard in the past, before the most recent few years of social media, it was more along the lines of companies that the executive level has all the money and then the, grunt workers who are actually doing the job don't make anything, right? So those executive level employees, they make all the money and they don't do any of the work. That's the definition I've heard. However, again, we just learned that most companies don't have more than 500 employees. I mean, we're talking about 2% of employers that have more than 500 employees. And so there's not as much of a gap between the executive level and the ground floor workers as we think that there is. I'm kind of wondering if that's a little bit skewed in our heads. A new definition that I have found is that corporate greed occurs when making money becomes the only goal and the other company's social responsibility is ignored. So, I can tell you, as an accountant and a small business strategic growth advisor, that the goal of a business is to make money. Literally, the reason you go into business is to make money. And so, if that ever becomes the non prominent goal in a business, that business dies. So, it is actually very important for a business owner to focus on making money in their business. And unfortunately, that's kind of a taboo thing to say, but it's true. It is the most important goal of your business. Think about it. If you have other goals, which you should have other goals. And if social responsibility is one of them, then that's great. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. However, you can't take care of yourself. You can't take care of your family. You can't take care of your employees and their families. You can't take care of any social responsibility. You can't make any charitable donations. You can't do any of this stuff if your business doesn't make money. Okay. So it has to be top priority, number one goal to make money. And the rest of it has to fall by the wayside because of the inherent value of the business. If the business isn't making money, why would you be in business? It's a hard truth, but it is a truth. Why would you be in business? So, another thing that I keep hearing is that profits are at an all time high. Maybe. I'm not saying that they're wrong. I haven't seen the documentation or the verification to show that this is a true statistic, but let's just say it is true, just for argument's sake. If it is true, and there are $700 million in profits going around between all these big corporations, you know what that means, right? Profit means income minus expenses minus taxes equal profits, right? So that means that that's the number that they're reporting on their tax return, and they're paying taxes on it. Okay. So that is at a minimum of $1.5 million in taxes. That's going back into the economy. That's going to support roads. That's going to support education. That's going to do all of the things that the government is supposed to do with that money, right? So they're not just making money and not paying taxes on it. That's not a thing. Okay. The other thing is, a lot of times with corporations, when you make that extra money, you end up putting it back into the business. And if you know any other small business owners, they will tell you the same thing. A lot of the times, the money doesn't necessarily get distributed to the owners. A lot of the times, it goes back into the company to build more products, to better their services, to hire more employees, to do whatever they need to do to grow the business. So, profits are not a bad thing. They mean that the company is doing well and that they can do good things with those profits. Okay. Then the other thing that I want to touch on when it comes to corporate greed is perspective. So I see this all the time. Corporation A is willing to spend millions and millions of dollars on whatever it means to make more money for the shareholders, but they're not willing to spend as much money on some other thing, social responsibility, charitable donation, XYZ, right? So here's the thing. The goal of the business is to make money, right? We've established this. And as a corporation, if you have the shareholders, your primary goal as the officer or board of directors has to be making the most money that you can for the shareholders. That's actually like part of the bylaws, part of the requirements. It's a fiduciary thing where you have to make that your primary focus. So it's not a surprise to see that with a lot of big corporations. But again, that's like 2% of most corporations. So it's not that big of a thing. It's not as big as I think it is appearing on social media. But the other thing is, let's think about our perspective on this one, because we can look and say, all this company ever does is try to make money, and all they ever do is, throw profits at executives and shareholders, and they don't care about anything else. Or we can say it's really amazing that this company gives away all this money towards some social responsibility, towards some charitable donation, towards some XYZ, right? We could be looking at the great things that they're doing, but we're choosing to focus on the negatives, right? And that is going to affect your entire outlook on the world. If you constantly focus on the negative and the bad that things are happening, and whether it's corporations or anything else, then that's going to be your life. But if you're constantly focusing on the good things that they're doing and the good that they bring to the world, then that's going to be your life. So it's kind of a choice of perspective, I think. The last note that I want to make regarding corporations and corporate greed is about ourselves. I want you to look inside, okay? You are not a victim. 2024, we are not victims. We live in the United States. We live in one of the most profitable, economically sound countries in the world, okay? We are not victims, okay? We do not have to find ourselves supporting corporations that we don't like or agree with how they're run, okay? And this isn't cancel culture. So I know that's a nice word that likes to get thrown around, but it is capitalism. You put your money where your mouth is. That's where that phrase comes from, okay? We put our money where we believe. Okay. So if we don't like how a corporation is being run, we don't like that the officers are showing corporate greed. We don't like that they only care about their shareholders and they don't care about their customers. They don't pay their employees enough, whatever it is, XYZ, whatever the reason is. You do not have to buy from that corporation. You don't have to shop at their store. You don't have to buy their service, whatever it is. You don't have to buy from them. You don't have to work from them. You can go somewhere else. You are not a victim. You are not stuck buying from that company. There are options. The other thing is that if you are feeling this way and you hate the corporate culture, you hate the corporate system, how all of this functions and how all of it's run, then I want to encourage you to exit the system, okay? The great thing about capitalism and the United States is that we have a huge entrepreneurial spirit here, especially since 2020, that has grown dramatically. So you can start a business if you want to. If you're unhappy with your pay, if you're unhappy with the type of entities that you work for, whatever it is, if you are unhappy with your situation, you can change it. You can start your own business. You can go to a different job. You can do whatever it is. That is the great and beautiful thing about the United States and the system that we operate on, is you can change your circumstances and you can change your life. It's just up to you. You're not a victim. You're not stuck. You can make changes. You can move forward. You can have a different life if you want it. If you don't, that's fine too. That's okay. So hopefully I have ruffled enough feathers when it comes to corporations and corporate greed and all of that fun stuff. And hopefully you can see kind of both sides of the argument here. Does corporate greed exist? Probably. I'm not saying it doesn't. By no means am I saying corporate greed doesn't exist. But what I am saying is that the majority of corporations in today's world are not like that. Well, thank you so much for spending a few minutes of your time with me today. I hope that you have a fantastic day, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video.